Well, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Gurecki, and I'm the Director of Publishing at the Colorado Mountain Club. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Introduction to Bird Hiking with Norm Lewis.
Hello, my name's Elle. I assist Sarah in the press department of CMC. I was also lucky enough to do a lot of work with this book, so I'm very excited to be here. This evening, we have CMC Press author Norm Lewis, who will discuss the basics of how to get into birding and hiking, including tips for beginners, necessary equipment, the basics of bird identification, and best seasons. Norm will also show photos from a few hikes from his book and discuss some good destinations for summer hikes to see birds.
All right. So Norm's book is The Best Front Range Bird Hikes. I'm kind of showing it on the screen here a little bit. And the Best Front Range Bird Hikes will be 20% off during tonight's presentation on our website, which is cmcpress.org. And we're going to put that in the chat for all of you. Anyone who buys a copy of the book during tonight's event at 20% off at cmcpress.org will be entered into a drawing to win a free gift membership to Colorado Mountain Club at the end of the night. So we're going to announce the winner at the end of the event. You can get a membership for yourself or give one to a friend. Also, if any of you are not yet Colorado Mountain Club members, we do have a new member orientation coming up on July 13th. We'll put that in the chat as well. And right now, for all new members who renew, all new members and membership renewals, we are offering a free pair of merino wool socks. These awesome, very comfy Colorado Mountain Club socks. Also, please keep an eye on the CMC calendar for upcoming birding hikes or classes with Norm. He plans to do a follow-up session soon to get more into the details of bird identification. So keep an eye on cmc.org on the calendar for upcoming events with Norm.
I am sure that you are all quite familiar with Zoom by now. However, here are a few friendly Zoom reminders. Please keep your microphones muted. And to help with internet bandwidth, we ask that everyone please keep their cameras off. As another reminder, this session is being recorded. And if you do have any questions, please drop those in the chat. Norm will be able to answer some of those during the end of his talk.
Yes, and Norm will answer all questions. He's going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. Please, if you have questions as he's talking, put them in the chat, and we may interrupt him from time to time with a pertinent question, and then all the rest of the questions we'll just save for the end. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Norm Lewis's claim to fame is that he actually might be a very distant relation of Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which actually started in his hometown of Clarksville, Indiana, on the Ohio River. As a geologist, he was always into hiking, but he discovered birding later in life when his brother asked if he wanted to go out and do some birding one year during spring migration. That was back in 1984, and Norm immediately fell in love with birding. In the 37 years since, he has enjoyed not only a great passion for birding, but also for sharing it with others. He currently leads birding outings and tours for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and is a past president of both the Colorado Field Ornithologists and the Denver Field Ornithologists. And now I'll turn it over to you, Norm.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. I've been looking forward to this. What we're going to try to do here is to do a combination of sort of introducing the book and melding that together with getting started in birding for those that have not done so. I'm sure there are quite a few rookies in the crowd, and also with pairing it up with hiking, which was the whole idea of the book to begin with. I would like to shout out a couple thanks to Sarah and Elle for their extensive work in getting this thing from a couple of Word documents on my computer into an actual book. And also to Frank Brzezinski, which quite a few of you are probably familiar with. He's a longtime CMC member and real enthusiastic and accomplished hiker and trip leader. And it was Frank who came up with the original idea for the book. So many thanks to those folks. As suggested by our opening slide here, birding has become probably the fastest growing pastime in the US, and that process was only accelerated by the pandemic because there was, birding proved to be a perfect pandemic pastime because it can be done socially distanced or alone very easily. So let's go ahead and dip into our content here. And again, if you have questions about some of these things as we go along, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat room, and Sarah will occasionally pass one along. The question, of course, that started this whole project was why mix birding with your hiking? I guess the easiest answer to that is we all know pretty much what hiking involves. You pick a destination, you hike there, and you hike back. It's not always necessarily that simple, but that's sort of the essence of it. In the book, I would like to point out there's a lot of information about elevation gain and distance and all that sort of thing, but one thing you will not find is any mention of hiking time, which most hiking books include. And that's quite intentional in that the time elapsed in doing a hike when you're also birding varies with what you're seeing, what kind of pace you're maintaining while you actually look for birds, whether you're just sort of casually looking as you proceed or actually doing some serious bird searching. So the time is pretty much irrelevant. These are a few reasons to include hiking in with your birding. One thing I would point out is that almost all of the photos in tonight's presentation were taken either at or near some of our hikes. There are a couple exceptions on this screen. The greater sage grouse in the upper left-hand corner there was actually taken over near Craig at a greater sage grouse lek, and the sunset picture on the right is sandhill cranes coming in during the fly-in at the Rose Sanctuary over in Nebraska. I put those in just because I happen to like the photos. But everything else from this point on, if you do the hikes in the book, you'll have an opportunity to see every bird in the presentation. So reason number one for including birding in your hiking is you just never know who you're going to run into on the trail. For example, this old gentleman, I was birding late last December and encountered this fellow on the trail. I never did catch his name, but it was pretty clear that the animals and birds liked him for whatever reason. And we were talking about some of his favorite birds, which for some reason all seem to be northern species like Arctic tern and snow bunting and snowy owl and things like that. We did spy a really nice looking bird, and I turned around to get my binoculars on it, and when I turned back, he was gone. Don't know where he went, but he was certainly a pleasant old fellow. But then a little later on another hike, I met him again. And this time he was being followed around by reindeer. And again, I never did quite make that connection as what was going on there. But again, we shared a very pleasant conversation, looked at a few birds, and as quickly as he arrived, he was gone. So getting into birding. This doesn't need to be expensive. It actually can be one of the least expensive hobbies of all of them. All you really need is a field guide, a pair of binoculars, and some headwear to keep the sun off, and you're good to go. But as with most pastimes, again, it isn't quite that simple. And if you get hooked like I did from the very beginning, it's not long before you start finding a few other things necessary to add to your toolkit, for example, a good camera, a spotting scope that you see there in the upper left, all kinds of birding gear like the vest in the middle there, good sturdy hiking boots, and so on and so on. So the price can go up fairly dramatically, fairly quickly. We've gone from a couple $100s to several $1,000s here. Now, there is always that possibility that you really get hooked and start wanting to build a substantial world life list, and in which case you'll need one of these, so that when you see that rarity spotted in Uzbekistan, you can get there as quickly as possible to pick up the bird. So what's involved in getting into birding? For the beginner, and for anyone who hasn't been doing it for too long, step number one obviously is to learn basic observation skills and practice them. You can get a lot of mileage out of looking at bird books, listening to bird recordings, and all that sort of thing, but bird skills are developed in the field. So here I've noted that you want to learn about observation, how to look at a bird, and then how to decide what's important and what's not. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Another thing that's often overlooked is what I call behavioral field marks, or just behaviors. There are a lot of birds that can be identified just by what they're doing without actually having to have a real good look at them. Obviously, bird calls, vocalizations, and vocalization substitutes are extremely important, just as important as learning how to recognize the bird from field marks. And of course, using range maps is crucial. That's one that many people would not even think of. I've put a typical range map on the right here, and the various colors show the bird's summer range, its winter range, and its year-round range. And so knowing how to tell when and where a bird is supposed to be goes a long way toward being able to identify it. And you notice there on vocalizations, I've also put vocalization substitutes. A lot of you have probably experienced those without even realizing it. If you've had a flicker drumming on your downspout, that is a vocalization substitute. There are a number of birds that make noise using natural or man-made items to attract a mate. And when you hear a bird drumming, which is what that's called, a woodpecker, they are not excavating a cavity. When a woodpecker is excavating a nest cavity, they try to be as quiet about it as possible because they don't want to attract attention to themselves. But when they decide to do some drumming, the idea is to be as loud as possible to try to impress the girls. And the downspouts on our houses are a great opportunity. In the natural world, hollow limbs of dead trees are equally attractive. So how do you choose where you're going to go on this bird outing? There are a number of different ways to do that, and I've listed a few here. Random destinations. By that, I mean, we just take off on a hike with no particular birding goal in mind and just see what we can see. And a very high percentage of what I do is exactly that. I'll just choose a hike I want to do or choose an area I'd like to visit and go there and do the hike, stroll around, whatever the case may be, and just see what shows up. There's also, of course, the specific species idea. I'd like to see a particular bird. And then, of course, things get a little simpler in that you just have to find a place that's known to host that bird and go there and look for it. A good example of that, of course, is our upper left-hand picture here, a white-tailed ptarmigan, which is a extremely popular Colorado bird. People come from all over to see our grouse, which a lot of folks are not aware that Colorado is a very popular grouse viewing site. I've actually done several tours for people across the state that involved trying to see all of our grouse, which is a pretty fair number. So then there's also specific population. Now I did kind of cheat and add one more non-Colorado slide here, which there on the lower right is sandhill cranes over on the South Platte at Kearney, Nebraska. And people, of course, come from around the world to experience the cranes. The one slide I showed earlier was the fly-in, which is when the cranes come in the evening to roost on the river. And then this slide shows all the cranes roosting and getting ready to do the fly out, which is the big show, because all the cranes will depart at once around dawn, making an incredible noise. And it's something to experience. Specific habitats also. Sometimes a person will say, I want to bird open ponderosa woodland or marshes or lakes. I'd like to see some waterfowl. I'd like to go down and walk the South Platte River and see what I can find in January in the way of waterfowl that are wintering. So specific habitats are also a good way to choose where to go birding. One huge issue, and this ties into the range map that we were looking at a minute ago, is bird migration. I've thrown up a migration anyway. This is the various migrations that take place, and kind of gives you an example of how varied, both by geography and season, migration really can be. But again, a real crucial piece of doing birding is knowing what's possible at what time of year. If you're looking for migrants, for example, that are just passing through Colorado, if I'm looking, for example, for a blackpoll warbler, I'll be looking for it only in May or September, because the bird does not nest here. It passes through on its way to its northern nesting grounds. And consequently, I won't be looking for any blackpolls in July or March. I know exactly when to look for it. And I also know that any other time of year, I'll have absolutely no chance of seeing one. Dovetailing with that real nicely is the birding by seasons. As I point out here, one of the secrets to successful birding is knowing what season to look for your target species, or what birds to expect at a site and season. In the book, I point out one thing I do include is best seasons. Most of these birding sites can be good any time of year, although some of them, like places above tree line, are quite prohibitive. But there are always best seasons. Is this a migration spot? Is it particularly good for summer nesting species? Is it maybe a winter bird destination? We have a lot of birds that nest up in Canada and the Arctic and migrate, do their fall migration only as far as Colorado. We always think of fall migration as birds leaving, but there are also a lot of them arriving that we don't get other times of the year. Field identification is really the fun part of birding, and it's basically fairly easy, but as with most pastimes, the devil's in the details. A lot of the birds I've put here on this page are pretty simple to identify, just because they're either brightly colored or, like in the case of the great horned owl, I think we've all seen great horned owl nests when we were out hiking, and that's pretty unmistakable. The sassy little ruddy duck down in the lower right-hand corner, obviously, is a pretty unmistakable bird, but not so if you happen to see it in its winter plumage. When it loses all that nice chestnut black and white color, the blue bill fades, and it just turns kind of a nondescript brown. So again, it's very much a matter of knowing what the bird is supposed to look like in the season which you're observing. But again, a matter of importance is learning the field marks that identify various birds. And of course, it's easiest to start with the common ones and then work your way through to more difficult identifications. These birds here are all ones that are very simple to identify, at least in their breeding plumage. We have a whole family of birds called the Impidinax flycatchers, which are just the very devil to identify, because there are a dozen of them and they all look exactly alike. Not quite exactly, but you really have to know what to look for and have good observational skills to be able to tell them apart. So one of the first steps in going back to our equipment that you need is to get a good field guide. The two that I put up here are the two most popular: Sibley Guide to the Birds, which is a fairly large book, and the National Geographic Guide, or the National Geo as we call it, which is a smaller book. These two are pretty complementary of one another, because the Sibley Guide is very long on pictures, but short on text, and the National Geo Guide is just the opposite. It has a good set of pictures, but a good bit more written information about the bird. So most birders want to have both of these. And then, as I mentioned over on the left there are also very nice guides that have been put together by the Stokes, a married couple that are quite famous among the birding population: Richard Crossley, Ken Kaufman. Even the old Golden guides, which some of you may have inherited from your grandfather, still work. There is also the Sibley app for smartphone, and we'll get into that a bit more later. But having a good field guide is crucial when you're starting out. So you've got the field guide. How do you use it? I've thrown up a couple examples here. The photo on the right, or the drawing on the right, is the parts of a bird, and in this case a passerine, which simply means the perching birds. Over half of all bird species are perching birds, not to be confused, of course, with ducks, geese, grebes, raptors, cranes, herons, egrets, which are very different in their physical structure from the passerines, the perching birds. But over on the left there, you can see two related birds. The western tanager, which is fairly common in our mountains, and the scarlet tanager, which is a bird of the east and quite rare in Colorado. And obviously this is sort of an extreme case where you're looking at one bird that's basically a yellow bird with a red head, and another bird that is a red bird with black wings. Sometimes it's not quite that easy. There are two other tanagers that we can get in Colorado: summer tanager and hepatic tanager, which are both red birds with dark wings. But in those cases, you have to go by bill color. And so it does get a little more challenging, even with the very colorful and seemingly obvious birds. Then we come to a list of things which is important to acquire. And keeping in mind, when you're getting started in birding, you aren't going to get all this right away. I've been birding for 37 years now. And if I don't learn something new every time I go out, I'm disappointed. I was out birding yesterday and learned several things that I didn't know before about a couple of the birds, and particularly the vocalizations, because a lot of these birds have a basic song, but they'll do all kinds of variations on it. And it can be very tricky to learn the song and then kind of recognize the bird as much by the character of the tone as by the notes it's singing. And that's learned in the field. I find that it can be helpful to listen to recordings of bird songs, but the pitfall there is if you try to do too much of it at once, it just becomes garbled. I find that I can't attempt to learn more than one or two songs at a time from a recording, or by the time I get to bird number 7, I've completely forgotten what bird number 1 sounded like. A very good way to accomplish this is go birding with more experienced birding partners. I have no shame when it comes to parasitizing other people's knowledge. I have several friends who are very, very good at ear birding, in other words, identifying birds by sound. Many birders depend on sound way more than sight. They will always hear the bird first and then attempt to find it and look at it. They will have already identified it just by its song. I've given a couple of resources here. The Macaulay Library, which is part of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, has literally millions of recordings of bird songs, can be found online. It's free for anybody to use. The Cornell lab is sort of the epicenter of birding in North America, and we'll get to that a little bit later also. And again, of course, there are smartphone apps, and a lot of these that are like field guides for the phone also include vocalizations. The Sibley guide, which is the one I use the most, I will frequently refer to in the field. If I'm hearing a song that I think I recognize, but I'm not real sure, I'll go to the Sibley guide, pull up the various songs, and it even identifies where in the country they were recorded. So you can determine if you're listening to a song that was recorded nearby or a song that was recorded in New York or someplace that might be irrelevant to Colorado. But that is, again, a very, very helpful resource in the field. So, are we ready to try a few trails? What I've done is identified a suite of trails, just a few here, that are actually from the book. And wanted to give you kind of an idea of the range of types of suites of birds that are available to be seen, depending on where and when you're hiking. This particular trail happens to be a photo I took up at Laurie State Park up by Fort Collins as I was getting up near the very top of the park. Very, very good birding site, and it is one of the hikes that's in the book. So what I've done is I've divided our hikes into elevation ranges. And I have one for you that's in the prairie, and then one that's foothills, one that's higher elevation, coniferous, basically spruce fir type forest, and then tree line. And the book has numerous hikes from each of those habitats or life zones. Bar Lake State Park, which I imagine everybody's familiar with, is one of the hikes in the book. And the hike takes you all the way around the periphery of Bar Lake, which is about a 9-mile walk. So even though it's flat with no elevation gain, it can be a long and hot hike. So if this is done in the summer, I highly recommend getting a really early start. But Bar Lake is one of the IBA's important bird areas that are identified across the country and the world, and hosts an astounding variety of bird life depending on the season. I put up a slide here just kind of illustrate this. The bird in the upper left is a northern harrier, which is a raptor that's in a family all by itself. Wonderful bird that is one of those ones can be identified by its behavior. Has a very buoyant flight, flies along usually 20, 25 feet off the ground, give or take, and looking down and searching for prey. And that flight style is very unique. And if you spot a harrier from a half-mile away, generally you can tell what it is without having to see anything physically about the bird. In the upper right is one of our Spizellas, that's the genus Spizella, Spizella sparrows, which are characterized by a basically clear breast, unstreaked, in other words. This particular bird happens to have a little spot in the middle of the breast, but all the Spizellas are unstreaked and very little birds. Most of them are summer residents around here. Chipping sparrow, clay-colored sparrow, brewer sparrow. This one happens to be our winter bird, American tree sparrow. Really neat looking little bird, and can be found around a lot of these areas in the lowlands in winter. And it's a very social little bird, which again gives a hint as to its identification. You find one tree sparrow, generally you're going to find a dozen. In the lower right is an American white pelican, and you can see this one features the breeding knob on the bill, telling us that it's, of course, a summer bird. What is the breeding knob for? Nobody really knows, but they tend to grow those in the summer when it's mating season. Like a lot of the large birds, the pelicans, and this is an inland bird, by the way. People tend to get excited when they see an American white pelican, and I've had many folks approach me and say, Norm, guess what? I saw a pelican. Well, they're extremely common here in the summer. They are a freshwater inland bird, and the pelican that most people are thinking of is brown pelican, which is a coastal saltwater bird. So the two are somewhat related, but are completely different in appearance, habitat, feeding style, and almost every other respect. In the lower left is a solitary sandpiper, which is a bird that you could find at Bar Lake in fall migration. It lives up to its name. It's usually seen alone, unlike a lot of the shorebirds that are seen in flocks. And once again, it's a good identification tool, because if you're wandering along a ditch or kind of a secluded area of the lake and see a lone shorebird with yellow legs and a prominent eye ring, which you can see this bird has, it's most likely going to be a solitary sandpiper. Spring through fall, Bar Lake hosts an astounding number of waterfowl. Here you can see a small fraction of the number of pelicans that are found there sometimes. Over sort of behind the pelicans, off photo to the left, is the famous Bar Lake bald eagle nest that's been there for many, many years and hosts one of our breeding pairs. Most of our bald eagles are migratory. Around the 1st of December, thousands of bald eagles wander into Colorado, and every reservoir will have a few around it. Then in about the 1st of March, they all leave and head back up toward Alaska and the Yukon, Canada, northern Canada, where they will be breeding. A few remain behind and are non-migratory and nest in Colorado. And one of the best known examples is the Bar Lake pair. There's also a huge cormorant colony out there, double-crested cormorants, which are a real interesting looking fish-eating bird that nests in big colonies in the trees. The Bar Lake colony has several hundred birds in it, and it's quite a sight. Then, of course, we have the summer nesting songbirds. Here are a couple that do nest around the area, and both of these photos actually were taken on a hike that I did around the lake. The one on the left is a blue grosbeak, which, as you can see, is real eye candy, and is a summer resident only. And the one on the right is an American goldfinch. I like the photo because it shows it doing what goldfinches love to do, which is feeding on thistle, which is their number one go-to food supply. Those goldfinches, of course, are non-migratory and can be seen at Bar Lake and around the plains year-round, and can be found fairly readily. I like to look when I'm birding out in the plains at the wild sunflower patches along the roads. A lot of times those will have American goldfinches and sometimes some other species mixed in with them, like pine siskins, that are a mountain bird, non-migratory, except that they do come down out of the mountains and join the goldfinches in the plains. And finally, another season at Bar Lake, the autumn. Bar Lake, like a lot of our big Eastern Plains reservoirs, is agricultural water. The state has the state park, but farming interests on water. And in the fall, when they start drawing that water down for irrigation, huge expanses of mudflats are exposed out there, and it becomes one of the outstanding places in Colorado to see shorebirds. Of course, shorebirds are another whole group unto themselves, and requires a whole different set of observational skills to tell one from another. I've thrown up a particularly easy one here, American avocet. There's not much mistaking that bird. But when you get down to some of what we call our peeps, which are the little sandpipers like western semi-palmated, mated white-rumped, and so forth, the details, it's like the Empidonax flycatchers. The devil is in the details. They all look very similar, and you really have to know what to look for to tell one from another. But again, practice using the field guide and getting help from a more experienced birder is a great way to start to learn those birds. Other examples, by the way, of agricultural reservoirs are Jackson Lake State Park, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, and one that's lesser known because it's not a state park, it's a state wildlife area, is Pruitt Reservoir out beyond Fort Morgan along I-76. Another fantastic birding spot at all seasons, mostly spring, summer, fall. There are birds there in the winter, but again, it gets drawn down fairly dramatically in the fall and is a tremendous fall shorebirding site. As much as I don't want summer to be over, I always look forward to August when I can start going out to Pruitt to pick through the shorebirds and see what might be there. A number of real interesting rarities have been found there just in the last couple of years. So we've checked the prairies. How about some foothills birding? As soon as we move from the prairie to the foothills, which of course means only maybe 1,000 feet in elevation, give or take, the suite of birds changes dramatically. What we have up here at the Rampart Range, which is another of my favorite spots, is basically open ponderosa woodland. And most of the lower elevation forests in our area are dominated by ponderosa pine, with a few other things mixed in. And the forest tends to be fairly open without too much clutter, if you will, on the forest floor, which makes for pretty good accessibility and pretty good birding. And at an area like Rampart, you can get a wide variety of woodpeckers, flycatchers. It has been my go-to spot for red crossbills for years. Just a very, very interesting spot. It's in the book, and it's probably the least developed of all the hikes in the book. Doesn't have any kind of official designation. There is a big parking lot there, which is shared with an off-road trail with a lot of dirt bikes and ATVs and things like that. But fortunately, their trail goes one way and the birding trail goes the other. There's no official markings, no official route, anything of the sort. It's just an area that has a somewhat defined trail through the open ponderosa forest, which can be terrific for birding at most seasons, even winter, although of course it's likely to be snowed in at times. Up at Rampart, many of my favorite birds can be found there. And these are birds that, well, can be found in low elevations in the Denver area, for example, other metropolitan areas, pretty much only in the winter when they may come down from altitude. Both of them also are found up at elevation, even in winter. The two pictured here are a red crossbill on the left, which has a rather amazing beak. The beak actually crosses like scissors and is designed for shearing seed husks so that the bird can get to the kernel inside. The really attractive looking bird on the right is an evening grosbeak. This is a very itinerant bird. If you said, Norm, where can I go and see an evening grosbeak? All I could tell you would be hope to get lucky, because these birds don't sit still in one area. They may show up at somebody's feeders, clean the place out and move on and not be seen again. These two photos happen to be taken on the same day in early spring up at Rampart. Then, of course, there are a lot of species that nest up there, including the crossbill from the previous slide. But we also get this really attractive looking Cassin's finch on the left, which is another seed eater. Some of you may have seen these at feeders down in town. They do wander into town in the winter. Look a lot like house finches, which most people are familiar with. But the head pattern with the bright red on the crown, where, for example, a house finch has brown, is a good way to tell them apart. The males, as you can see here, also have a pink wash on the breast, but are unstreaked, unlike the male house finches. Those are the sorts of details that you learn with just a little bit of repetition. And the challenge, of course, is to get out in the field and then start trying to remember all these things that you've learned. The bird on the right is another signature bird of our foothills, olive-sided flycatcher, which is unique for its vocalization. It's everybody's favorite bird call because the bird sounds like it's asking for a malted beverage. The call says, "Quick, 3 beers, quick, 3 beers." It's very distinctive, and I had no idea that birds were fond of alcohol, but apparently this one is. And one of the real treats up in these elevations, Rampart is a particularly good place to find woodpeckers and sapsuckers. There are several others that are in the book: Staunton State Park, Laurie State Park, Flying J is a Jeffco open space, and many other areas that are kind of in that 1,000 to 5,000 foot elevation range above the prairie, of course. That would make it really 6,000 to 9,000 up in that sort of range. Red-naped sapsucker is a typical bird of that elevation and just an absolutely gorgeous bird. You can see one here that has a beak full of food and was returning to its nest cavity to poke those bugs down the throats of its young. Its relative, that's another absolutely gorgeous bird, is Williamson sapsucker. And this is one of those birds that the first time you see one, you're not sure that you've seen an actual bird or whether somebody is fooling with you and nailing a stuffed bird or something up in the tree. This thing with its red throat, its yellow belly, and of course that stunning black and white body and head plumage is, again, real eye candy. And this one, like the red-nape, also has a beak full of probably ants, and it's probably heading to its nest cavity to feed the young. So we pass from the foothills up to a completely different life zone, spruce fir forests, which of course are between 9,000, 9,500 feet up to tree line at around 11,000 approximately. And the best representation of this life zone in the book is the Chicago Lakes Trail. I'm sure a lot of you have done that hike, but you may not have paid attention to the birds along the way. The trail starts there at Echo Lake, and then of course goes up a glaciated valley all the way up to the Chicago Lakes up at the top in the cirque formed by the ancient glacier, the head of the glacier when they were active in the last period of glaciation. And of course, when you get to that point, you're looking up at Mount Evans. The Canadian zone or spruce fir zone has a whole suite of really interesting birds. The cover photo for the book, in fact, is one of those birds, pine grosbeak. Another very
Norm,
yes.
we've got a question. I wonder if you want to address it before going further into the
Sure.
the uppermost life zone. So someone wrote in from your last slide, what is the difference between sapsucker and flicker or woodpecker?
Mostly it's behavioral. Structurally, they're very similar, but you start getting into some of the fine details start dividing those birds into their various genera, which is the plural of genus. Sapsuckers, for example, just as their name implies, are very fond of sap, and they use it for a couple of different things. If you're in an area where you're looking for sapsuckers, a dead giveaway that the sapsuckers are present in the area is the sap wells that they will excavate. And if you start looking at trees when you're hiking in the foothills elevations, look for a whole kind of symmetrical series of little rectangles all cleared through the bark of a tree. You might look at it and think, what the heck is that? You know, it looks like something that's been made almost like a little work of art or something. And that is the sapsucker excavating those wells. The birds like the sap, and they also feed on the insects that get caught in that sap. Woodpeckers, of course, do nothing of the sort. They are almost entirely birds which feed on grubs and so forth that are found under the bark of trees. And they even have some preferences. The sapsuckers, for example, really like aspens. You'll find a lot of active sapsucker nests excavated in living aspen trees, whereas the woodpeckers, some of them actually prefer dead trees. And when they choose a live tree, it's very frequently a pine or a conifer. Flickers, which are also a woodpecker, but a different critter entirely, have a much more varied diet. You probably have seen flickers on your lawn because they'll eat virtually anything. And one of their main food items is worms and insects that they'll pick out of lawns, and of course, natural grasses and so forth. So the differences are pretty much behavioral. There are some structural differences, but it's almost entirely the differentiations are made on their feeding habits and behaviors. Hope that helps. Were there any other questions at the moment?
I think that's it, although please keep them coming.
Okay, yeah, feel free to put some questions up because I like the discussion that it generates along lines that I may not have thought about. Oh, actually, I didn't finish with this slide. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this character that will be more than happy to steal your lunch if you're eating, for example, at the picnic area there at Echo Lake. These birds are quite common around there and will hop right up on your table and steal something at any given opportunity. These guys used to be called gray jays. The name was changed just in the last couple of years to accommodate the fact that they are the national bird of Canada. So their name was changed to Canada jay. You can find them again at the picnic areas and upper elevations, and sort of the same sort of areas where you'd find Clark's nutcracker, which is named after William Clark of Lewis and Clark. And even at the upper elevations, where we sometimes tend to think of things as being a bit monochromatic, there is a lot of color. A bird that ranges from the foothills all the way up into almost tree line is Steller's jay. I'm sure everybody's probably seen one of those on their hikes. This particular photo was sort of a disheveled looking bird that had found itself a peach pit, which I thought was sort of amusing. Another bird that is pretty common through the same elevation range as Western Tanager, and I threw in elephant head over on the right as an example of some of the absolutely gorgeous wildflowers that are found up near tree line. And once you get up there, then you're looking at, of course, I've thrown in a couple of critters here, the mountain goats and marmots, which are signature animals of tree line. But a couple other somewhat more subtle characters here. The upper middle photo there is a rosy finch. And we have 3 species of rosy finch, but only one of them remains in Colorado in summer. And that's the brown-capped rosy finch that's pictured here. And that photo was actually taken at Summit Lake, where you can find rosy finches fairly reliably in the summer, but it might take some looking. As colorful as they are, they blend in really well with rock fields and so forth. The lower photo there is an American pipit, which is another bird that nests above tree line and can frequently be seen in the upper spruce fir type habitat, where it's beginning to peter out into pretty much just what we call tundra. Of course, it's not real tundra, but everybody calls it that. So we'll stick with that particular habit. But those birds can frequently be seen in the same sorts of areas where the other animals and the rosy finch here are seen. And then, of course, you get up above tree line, and again, this is one of those species-specific type of habitats. Anybody who's birding above tree line might find a few birds, but the thing that they're almost always looking for is white-tailed ptarmigan. And as you can see from this one, in their summer plumage, they're basically rock and brown colored. I'm sure some of you have had similar experiences to what I have when hiking above tree line, of almost stepping on one of these birds and having it scare the heck out of you when it flushes, and you didn't see it until you were right on top of it. They're sort of a fun bird in that they're this color in the summer and snow white in the winter, and consequently in their habitat can be really difficult to see. I still recall the first ones I saw, which were up on Mount Breckenridge, above tree line in the late fall, and they hadn't finished molting into their full winter white plumage. So they were basically sort of calico colored. They were white, brown, and cream colored, and stood out like a sore thumb, no matter what the background was. Kind of a dangerous time of year for those birds, which are a target species for golden eagles. And of course, once you get up there, the wildlife becomes a little more sparse, but there are still a lot of interesting things to see along with the birds, like this Parnassian on the left, which is a high elevation butterfly that's relatively common and always a surprise to see flying around up above tree line. And of course, that little character on the right, everybody I'm sure is quite familiar with, running in and out of the rocks above tree line with mouthfuls of grass to get its den and its winter food supply gathered up. The other birds that you can see up at tree line are interesting. The previously mentioned American pipit, the top photo there was taken actually on a snowfield in summer. And the one on the left is a white-crowned sparrow. And this bird, and here's an identification trick, just as an example of the sorts of things that you can learn that will help you with your identifications. The lore on a bird, L-O-R-E, is the area between the beak and the eye. And we have a subspecies or race of white-crowned sparrow called mountain white-crowned, in which that lower is black, as you can see on this bird. That particular photo was taken up in the little forest. I'm gagging the name now, but you know, the ancient trees, the bristlecones, up on Mount Evans. We get the Gambel's white-crowned in the winter, which has a white lore, and those are birds that nest in the Yukon and northern Canada and migrate down here in the winter. So let's talk a little bit about some resources. Online help is readily available. The Sibley Guide to the Birds of North America is a very popular one. It's basically the only one I use. Although there are a couple others that I use occasionally, but it has a wonderful suite of all the birds. It also, has links right on the app to give you written information, and then there's a section on the range map of the bird. It has a whole suite of vocalizations, and then of course the photos. eBird Mobile is an app that we should touch on here. I did a class on eBird for the Mountain Club a couple months ago because a lot of people had expressed interest in it. It's a free website that's coupled to this app from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, which, like I said, is ground zero for North American birding. And they developed eBird, which is a tremendous birding tool. You can load all of your sightings into it. It keeps all of your lists for you: life list, county list, national list, foreign country list, everything you can imagine. And the field app, the eBird Mobile, you can use right in the field to record what you're seeing, and then you just hit submit, and it transfers all your information into your personal site on the eBird website. Also from the lab is Merlin, which is a bird identification tool that asks you for various characteristics of the bird you're looking at, and then gives you some suggestions as to what it might be. iBird Pro is another smartphone field guide. Song Sleuth is one that I just started using, which is an app that you use for recording bird songs. And it has some very clever features that make it a little easier to get a good recording of bird vocalizations in the field. Just something that I've never been particularly good at, but I find that this app really helps. Then there are organizations, of course, and if you're going to get interested in birding and you want to start picking up information from more experienced birders, all of these organizations are very worth joining. I put Denver Field Ornithologists at the top, dfobirds.org. It's very cheap to belong to, $20 a year, I think, or $25 if you want the paper version of their newsletter. But the real feature of DFO is that they run hundreds of field trips, and they're all free. And a lot of people are under the mistaken impression that you need to be an expert to go on birding field trips. For the most part, experts don't need field trips. They're far beyond that, go do a lot of their birding by themselves or with other experts. All of these field trips are designed for beginning to intermediate birders, and a great opportunity to glean information from the experienced guides on those trips. Colorado Field Ornithologists is well worth belonging to. They're a little bit more of an academic organization. They have a wonderful magazine that comes out quarterly. Denver Audubon is also excellent. They're very much known for their outreach, although they also, have birding programs like their Master Birder program, which is a great way to get intensive training in all aspects of field birding. And then, of course, there's the Cornell Lab that I've mentioned a couple times, which is the one that sponsors created eBird. And they also have Project Feeder Watch, which is a very fun thing to participate in. You count birds at your feeder in the winter and put those into their website. And again, all this information that goes to the lab, all of your records and everything are kept for you, and then that information is shared with the lab and has become an extremely valuable research resource. So you can not only have a way to keep all your bird records, but participate in citizen science too. So that wraps up this portion of the presentation. This green-tailed towhee, who's giving you the eye here, encourages you to get out there and go birding. The first bullet point here says the tail will grow in the telling, which is as true for this as it is for anything. You need to get out and do it in order to learn. You go at your own speed. Do not get frustrated if you don't turn into a top expert in your first month. But the learning process, fortunately, is as much fun as anything. and not like some hobbies like playing the cello, which requires decades of practice before you really get to the place where you can really play. You can do birding from your first day out and consider yourself successful. You can take it to whatever level you want, from just looking at a few birds in your backyard at feeders to, becoming a top expert and writing field guides and so on and so forth. This is not a contest, although a lot of birders sort of try to turn it into one. You've heard about big ears and that sort of thing, which are a whole different offshoot of the birding experience, and not at all necessary for the day-to-day birder to get involved in. And above all, prepare to be surprised, because I can guarantee you every time you go out, something will happen that you weren't expecting. And that wraps. So we can take some discussion and questions and so forth.
All right. Okay, Norm, well, we do have some questions for you here. The first one is, do you have a favorite bird or a specific kind of bird you'd like to see that maybe you haven't seen yet?
Well, that's sort of two different questions, and I can answer both of them. Coming up with a favorite bird is very difficult, because you'd have to say my favorite bird in Colorado or in the United States or in Ecuador or Panama. Lots of favorites. In this area, one of my personal favorites is bobolink, which is a wonderful looking bird. We say it wears the backward tuxedo because it's black on the front and yellow on the back, and has this beautiful yellow back of its head. You can find them in tall grass parks and so forth. Up in Boulder, there are a lot of places that are known for having bobolinks. Along Cherryvale Road, where there are a lot of hay fields, is a great place to see them, and also up on Highway 66 between Longmont and Lyons. As far as birds I have not seen, there are a lot of those. My personal North American life list is somewhere around 670, and there are on the order of 1,000 possibilities. So there are a lot of things I haven't seen. Probably some of the ones that I would most like to see are the far north species like parakeet, auklet, and some of the ones that can only be found up in the Aleutians and the Pribilofs and some of those areas, which I have not visited. So that would be something that I'd love to see that I have not. Of course, when you get into international birding, sky's the limit. There we have 10,000 possibilities, and I've seen about 1,500 of them. So a lot of birds out there that I haven't seen. By the way, a fellow by the name of Noah Stryker decided to do an international big year a couple of years ago, and his goal was to see half of the birds in the world in 1 year, and he did it.
Wow.
So I forget what his final count was, but he did it with a pretty comfortable margin, something on the order of 5,500 birds while traveling pretty much the entire globe. That's called taking it to extremes.
Yeah. All right, we have another question here. Do ospreys eat only fish?
Yes. There's one that's pretty easy to answer. And
Okay.
Osprey is a bird that you wouldn't necessarily associate with Colorado, but in the summer they're actually quite common here. And you've probably seen a lot of the parks and so forth are now putting up osprey platforms where the birds build their big, heavy stick nest and pretty much subsist entirely on fish. One interesting factoid about osprey is that, of course, they're extremely adept. If you've ever seen one plunge into the water after a fish, it's quite a sight to see. But when they come up with the fish, they'll start flying and they'll rotate the fish so that it's facing forward, so that it's more aerodynamically favorable and doesn't create as much drag as they're taking it back to the nest.
Okay, we've got a bunch more questions here. So where's your favorite hike to see a variety of birds?
To see a variety? Well, that's dirty pool. But no, some of the ones I think best variety of birds, probably some of the foothills, other than Bar Lake. Now, Bar Lake, of course, you can see amazing numbers of birds out there depending on the season. But to maximize number of species, I like places like Flying J Open Space, Laurie State Park, is excellent. Mount Falcon, right near town here, is very good in that regard. So is Lair of the Bear, right up Bear Creek Canyon here. In late summer, Lair of the Bear, when all the young hatchlings are out and becoming independent, it's possible to see dozens of species of birds at Lair of the Bear in that relatively easy 2-mile loop that covers pretty much the entire park.
What is the best place to see raptors migrating and what time of year?
Raptors are a whole other ball of wax. So a couple suggestions. First of all, we have a relatively newly discovered, meaning in the last 20 years, hawk migration route right up the Hogback on the west side of town. And the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies actually has a hawk count up there in March and April. Raptor migration takes place earlier than songbird migration. So March and April is the best time to see migration. However, if you just want to see raptors, there's nothing like the far eastern plains in winter. I make numerous trips out to the plains in December, January, February, looking for a wide variety of raptors. We have ferruginous hawks, rough-legged hawks, which we have only in the winter, red-tailed hawks, which we have year-round, prairie falcon, merlin, on and on. There's just all kinds of varieties of raptors that you can see out there, not during migration, but just observing.
What is the impact of climate change on bird populations?
Profound. And we're learning more and more by the day. In my lifetime, and even in the last couple decades, I have watched birds' ranges change fairly dramatically. I've watched when they arrive and depart change fairly dramatically. You're seeing birds, for example, at times of year now that we didn't see them. So climate change is definitely having an effect on the birds. The little pika that I showed in one of my slides in terms of mammals is being forced up. The pika, of course, needs cold climates. And as the climate warms, that little critter is being forced into higher elevations, and there will come a point where it simply runs out of places to go. So we're seeing very, very interesting and not necessarily favorable outcomes from climate change.
Is there a time of day that, that birds tend to be more active?
Dawn. That's an easy one.
Okay.
Yeah, in the summer, for example, if I want to go birding way out in the eastern plains, like Kit Carson or Cheyenne counties out that way, or out around Ray or Jumbo Reservoir by Julesburg, I'll typically leave at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and try to arrive out there at dawn, because the birds will be most active at dawn and for a couple hours afterwards. Of course, in cooler times of year, it's not quite as important, but in the summer, you'll find that birding activity dies almost completely from about 11 o'clock through early evening.
Is it common for hummingbirds to nest in the same area as in come back each year? And would that be the same bird or offspring?
That one is almost impossible to say. Intuitively, I would say yes, but since I don't think there have been a whole lot of studies, at least not any that I've read, involved in banding hummingbirds, which would be the only way you could tell if it was the same bird. But as everybody knows, I'm sure broad-tailed hummingbirds, which are our default hummingbird around here, are extremely common in the mountains. And another factoid about hummingbirds, by the way, is male hummingbirds are the type section or the poster child for deadbeat dads, because they take absolutely no involvement whatever in building the nest, rearing the young, or anything else. That's entirely up to the female. But in terms of returning to the same site, I'm kind of thinking they probably do, but I don't think there's really any way to demonstrate that for sure.
Let's see, someone asks, what does a bird have to do to become one of your favorites? I
Well,
guess,
you can do a
and
lot
tell
of
us
things
what your favorite birds are.
to attain that lofty status. And typically it's going to be either its appearance or its behavior. Um, for example, I love, and who doesn't love, a painted bunting, which looks like a bird, which is not real. The bird, you know, has red, blue, yellow, every imaginable color on it. They're relatively common down around, you know, South Texas, Southeast Arizona. You see them in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. And I like them simply because of their appearance. That also applies to a lot of the warblers, which are the little gems of the northern forests. Birds like Blackburnian warbler, prairie warbler, black-throated blue warbler, black-throated green warbler, prothonotary warbler are all absolutely gorgeous little birds. So, of course, they become favorites. But then there are birds that have behavioral things that make them a favorite, like American dipper. Those of you that hike the canyons and the mountain streams have probably seen these little birds. You may or may not have known what you were looking at, but they're a little nondescript gray bird, but they have the densest feather, the highest feather density of any bird. A little less than robin-sized bird will have 10,000 feathers. They're absolutely totally waterproof. They feed by, they'll stand on a rock and do these deep knee bends, which is real amusing to watch. And then they'll just jump into the water and sink like a rock because they're so dense. They'll walk around on the bottom, picking up invertebrates and so forth, and then pop like a cork back out of the water and back onto their rock. And these little birds never leave the water, ever. When you see a dipper, even when they fly, they don't even fly across land. They follow the course of the stream up and down and nest on rocks in the middle of the stream, under bridges. A great place to see them. They do migrate upwards, and they follow their streams up in the summer, but some remain down here. And Morrison Park, right over by Morrison, is a great place to see summer nesting dippers. So
Great.
that's one because of its behavior.
Okay, so if you were to recommend one hike in the Front Range that's good for beginners to go, what would it be?
Lair of the Bear.
Okay.
Of course, again,
Great.
you have to specify a time of year. But if we're talking summer, also Genesee Mountain Park. Genesee, all through the summer, and especially in later summer, gets a combination of lots of nesting species that nest there. And then as fall starts to come on, a lot of the mountain species start coming down, like solitary yellow rump warblers and so forth. And you can get a real nice mix of species. So I'd say those two are as good as any for seeing a large number of species in a relatively small area.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we're going to do the drawing. Thanks to everyone who bought a copy of the Best Front Range Bird Hikes during the event. I'm literally drawing a name out of a hat right now. And our winner is Jean Starr. So Jean, congratulations. I'm going to send you a gift membership in the mail tomorrow. You can use it for yourself or for a friend. So thanks everyone for attending tonight.
Sarah,
And
comment, if you don't mind. I
please.
also like to remind everybody that because of the enthusiasm that's been displayed for birding and the participation we've had in a few events, we certainly will be doing some additional classes and bird hikes. So watch the CMC calendar for those events. I'm kind of guessing that our first class will probably be around late July, and I'm going to be gone on a 2-week trip here coming up shortly. But when I get back, I'll also get together with, I'm not an official hike leader at this point. Tom Waymeyer has been kind enough to help me host hikes, and I'll get together with him and set up a couple where we can try out some of these trails.
That sounds great. Norm has done a couple of birding hikes already. They've filled up right away. So I think there's a good demand for them, and we hope we can get more bird hikes on the CMC calendar, as well as more of these talks with Norm. So thank you everyone so much for attending. So great to see you here, and enjoy your birding. And thank you again, Norm, for the talk tonight.
Absolutely welcome. Thanks everybody for attending.
Good night,
Yeah.
everyone.
Go birding.